We're starting on page 92, chapter 14. What can Duncan Dougal do? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had been worried that Broxholm might want me for one of his average slots. It never even crossed my mind that I could be considered the top student in the class. Peter, what am I going to do? I wailed. Peter shrugged his skinny shoulders. Don't worry, he said. I've got a plan. I thought he meant the camera. He didn't, but I didn't know that then. The plan he actually meant was so weird, I never would have thought of it. I took a deep breath and tried to settle down. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that, I said, referring to the camera. I think I figured out the best time for me to get back into Broxholm's house. You mean us, said Peter. I shook my head. I mean me, I said. I'm going to do it tomorrow morning during my music lesson time. That way, Mr. Smith won't suspect anything when I leave the room. I figured if I use my bike, I can make it to his house and back before I'm really missed. I'll get in trouble later, but at least I'll have the proof we need. You're not going alone, said Peter. Yes, I am, I said. If we both take off, it's going to look suspicious, especially considering the amount of time we've spent together lately. Maybe suspicious enough that Broxholm will pretend he's sick, just so he can check up on us. We don't want him walking in on us while we're taking the photos. I doubt we could manage to sneak out of his house without getting caught a second time, especially if he's actually looking for us. Then I should go instead, said Peter. You might not have enough time. I'll just skip school altogether. Now, how can you do that? I asked. Peter sighed. I keep trying to tell you. It doesn't make any difference what I do. As long as I don't get in trouble with the law, no one cares. Peter, that's not a very nice way to talk about your parents, I said. I don't have parents, he snapped. I've got a parent, period, and he doesn't care what I do as long as I don't get in trouble. I felt stupid. Here I had known this kid for 6 years, and I didn't even know he only had one parent. All right, I said, we'll go together. Why don't I just go alone, said Peter. I shook my head. I got this whole thing started. It's my job. Actually, I wasn't really feeling all that noble. I wanted to see Miss Schwartz again, to make sure she was okay, and also to get some advice. Peter shrugged. You're the one who's going to land in hot water. If that's the way you want to do it, it's okay with me. Then it was time to go back inside. Even though the major weirdness was over for the day, you could sense a kind of nervous energy around the classroom. The other kids didn't really believe the rumors about Mr. Smith being an alien, at least not yet. But after the little show Stacy and Mike had put on, they were starting to take things pretty seriously. It would have been funny if it wasn't so scary. The next morning, I rode my bike to school, carrying my piccolo and camera in my backpack. As I was putting the lock on my front wheel, Duncan Dougal came sidling up to me and said, if you and Peter are pulling some kind of joke on me, I'm going to turn you into peanut butter. Strange as it may seem, Duncan's threat made me feel better. At least I knew there were some things in the world that I could still count on. It's no joke, Duncan, I said, drawing a cross over my heart with my fingers. He looked at me suspiciously. Then he nodded. Okay, he said. Now what are we going to do about it? Now that was something I hadn't expected. An offer of help from Duncan Dougal. Think quick, I told myself. This may not happen again for another 10 years. I looked at Duncan. How would you feel about skipping school today? I asked. He grinned, showing that big gap between his front teeth. I love skipping school, he said. He wasn't telling me something I didn't know. One of the things that made it possible to survive having Duncan in our class was the fact that he was out of school so often. We all knew his older brother wrote his excuses for him, but none of us were about to tell. We weren't crazy enough to do something that would put Duncan in our classroom any more often than necessary. Besides, if one of us told and Duncan found out who did it, he would massacre that person. but it might be useful to have him along. If I could be sure of one other thing. Can you go someplace with Peter without picking on him? I asked. Sure, said Duncan. I like Peter. I looked at him. To my astonishment, he looked like he really meant it. I shook my head. What can you say to someone like that? All right, I said. You go do whatever it is you do when you skip school. I'm going to sneak out of the building at 9:15. I want you to meet me at the corner of Pine and Parker. You'll need a bike. I thought about telling him not to steal it, but decided that might seem too insulting. Duncan nodded his head. Where are we going? He asked. I looked him right in the eye and said, Peter and I are going to break into Mr. Smith's house and take pictures of the force field where he's holding Miss Schwartz prisoner. I want you to stand outside and be our lookout in case Mr. Smith gets wise and comes back to stop us. I hesitated, then added, I hope you won't mind facing an alien death ray. I suppose that was a rotten thing to say, but the look on Duncan's face made it worth it. Chapter 15. Hooky for 3. I was so nervous that I didn't even look at Mr. Smith when it was time to leave for my lesson. Forgive me, Mr. Bamwick, I thought as I headed away from his room toward the side door. Peeking out to make sure there was no one around, I sprinted to my bike, unlocked it, and headed out of the schoolyard as fast as I could. Duncan was waiting at the corner of Pine and Parker, sitting on a blue 5-speed. Follow me, I said, and kept riding for the edge of town. I checked my watch. It had been 12 minutes since I left the class. If I could make it back just as fast, that would give me 6 minutes to take the pictures. Peter was waiting in front of the hedge at Broxholm's house. I could see his smile quickly turn to a frown when he saw who was with me. His pale face turned even paler as we drew up. What's he doing here? Demanded Peter. I was impressed. It took a lot of nerve for Peter to say that in front of Duncan. To my surprise, it was Duncan who tried to make peace. I just came here to help, he said. He did say it kind of belligerently, but he was holding up his hands with the palms out to show that he meant peace. He's going to be our lookout, I added, hoping that Peter would see the wisdom of this. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay, he said grudgingly. I guess you can stay. Duncan looked as pleased as a naughty puppy who's just been let back into the house. What do you want me to do? He asked. Stand right there, I said, indicating a spot just inside the hedge where he could have a good view of the sidewalk. If you see Mr. Smith coming, run up on the porch and pound on the door to give us a warning. Then run for your life. Duncan nodded seriously and took his place. I looked at Peter. He gave me a nod, and we headed for the back of the house. To my relief, the broken lock was still where Peter had jammed it back in place after our last adventure here. I had figured that as a temporary tenant, Broxholm probably wouldn't keep that close an eye on things that needed repair on the place. It was nice to find out I'd been right. We opened the door and headed back into the alien's lair. I felt a little more at ease this time. After all, we could be pretty sure that Broxholm would stay at school. We knew exactly where he was going. And we had a lookout to keep us from being surprised. How could we go wrong? The answer to that question was even worse than I expected. For the first few minutes, everything went as smooth as could be. We made it out of the cellar and into the attic with time to spare. Nothing had changed. The column of blue light was still there, and poor Miss Schwartz was still trapped right in the middle of it. I rushed over to it and placed my hands against the force field. Almost instantly, I could hear Miss Schwartz's voice inside my head. Hello, Susan. What are you doing here? We came to take some pictures of you so that we can prove what's going on, I thought back to her. Her reply scared me. Weren't you here just a few minutes ago? She asked. She sounded confused. I bit my lip. Was she all right? Of course, since the thought was about her, Miss Schwartz picked up on it. I'm not sure, she responded. It's getting so very hard to think in here. She paused for a moment, then asked, What day is this? It's Tuesday, I thought. Tuesday, the 24th of May. Her reaction almost knocked me over. You must do something, she thought desperately. It's only 2 days until Broxholm is planning his pickup. Susan, you have to do something. I know, I replied. Her fear was coming through as clearly as her thoughts, and it was making me afraid too. Our conversation was interrupted by Peter. Susan, we can't just stand here and chat. We've got to get these pictures taken. He was right, of course. Hang on, Miss Schwartz, I thought. We'll get you out of there somehow. Peter had already started flashing. That's good, he said. Let me get a couple more of you standing next to her. Then move away from the force field so I can get some of Miss Schwartz by herself. I was glad Peter was there. I might have gotten so wound up talking to Miss Schwartz that I wouldn't have taken the pictures in time to get back to school. But he was working fast. In a few minutes, he had used up most of the camera's memory, taking some pictures with flashes, some without, working from all different angles. I helped, and we did everything we could think of to make sure we got at least one good shot. We were just trying to figure out the last angle when we heard a terrible scream from downstairs. Ah! 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 I couldn't make much sense of the words, but I recognized the voice. It belonged to Duncan Dougal.